A royal guard has revealed what he found in King Charles's private study, and his chilling words, "It was nothing like I expected," have sent shockwaves across the country. The study, known for its strict security and locked drawers, holds many private items, but this guard's discovery has raised questions even palace insiders are afraid to answer. Something hidden inside has now become the center of a growing storm, and everyone is scrambling to understand why it was kept so secret. What did the guard truly see? And why was it never meant to be discovered? The night the guard found the king's secret, Thomas Hale was the kind of man who noticed everything. After 23 years serving in the Royal Guard, he had learned to read silence the way others read books. He was gentle in his manner, always offering a kind word to the young staff members who looked nervous during their first weeks at Buckingham Palace. As he made his way toward the private wing where King Charles often spent his evenings, Thomas noticed the first unusual detail. The hallway was empty, completely empty. Thomas slowed his pace, his eyes scanning every shadow and doorway. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of feeling that makes the hair on your neck stand up, even when you can't explain why. He approached the door to the king's private study, and his heart skipped a beat. The door was open. Thomas stood there for a moment, unsure whether to knock or call out. What if the king was inside and simply forgot to close the door properly? But that didn't make sense either. King Charles was meticulous about such things. Thomas took a quiet breath and leaned closer, listening. That's when he heard it, a faint shuffle, like fabric brushing against wood or papers being moved. The sound was so soft that Thomas almost convinced himself he had imagined it. But then it came again, just barely audible. Someone, or something, was moving inside that room. "Your Majesty?" Thomas called out gently, his voice respectful but firm. There was no answer. The shuffling stopped immediately, as though whoever was inside had frozen in place. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He placed one hand on the door and pushed it open slowly, just wide enough to peer inside. The study was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the richly decorated room. Books lined the walls, and the scent of old leather and wood polish filled the air. But there was no one there. The room appeared completely empty. Thomas stepped inside, his eyes moving carefully over every detail. The king's desk sat in the center of the room, its surface usually neat and organized. But tonight something was out of place. A document was sticking out from beneath the king's personal diary, a leather-bound book that Charles kept close and rarely let anyone touch. The corner of the paper jutted out at an odd angle, as if someone had been in a hurry and hadn't bothered to tuck it away properly. Thomas walked closer, his instincts screaming that this was deliberate. This wasn't carelessness. This was a message. Why would a document be left like this? Why would the door be open, the attendants missing, and the room seemingly abandoned in the middle of the evening? Thomas reached out carefully, hesitating for just a moment before lifting the diary. The paper beneath was covered in handwriting, elegant, precise script that Thomas recognized immediately as belonging to King Charles himself. But this wasn't an official document. It looked personal, private, the kind of thing that should never be left out in the open. Thomas's mind raced. Should he read it? Should he leave it alone and report what he found? But report it to whom? And what exactly had he found? A forgotten letter? A secret the king had meant to destroy? Or something far more dangerous, evidence that someone had been in this room without permission, rifling through the king's private belongings? The thought sent a chill down Thomas's spine. If someone had breached the king's study, if someone had access to his most personal thoughts and documents, then the entire security of the palace had been compromised. He looked around the room again, searching for any other signs of disturbance. Everything else appeared normal, untouched. But that only made the document more suspicious. It was placed too perfectly, too obviously, almost as though it had been staged, as though someone wanted it to be found. But why, and by whom? Thomas felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Whatever was written on that paper, whatever secret it contained, he knew that discovering it would change everything. This wasn't just another quiet night patrol. This was the beginning of something much larger, something that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. What secret had King Charles been hiding? And who else knew about it? The letter the king could not open. Charles was the kind of king who read poetry before bed, who spoke to his plants because he believed everything deserved kindness, and who sometimes stood at his window late at night wondering if he was doing enough, being enough, living up to everything expected of him. That Tuesday afternoon, Charles walked into his private study with slow, deliberate steps. The late autumn light filtered through the tall windows, casting golden patterns across the Persian rug. In his hand, he carried a sealed envelope. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, just breathing. He walked to his desk and set the envelope down carefully, as though it might break. Then he stepped back, staring at it like it was something dangerous. For several minutes, Charles did nothing but look at that envelope. He reached for it twice, his fingers hovering just above the seal, but each time he pulled his hand away. Whatever was inside, he wasn't ready to face it. Or perhaps he was afraid of what it might contain. His mind spun with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Who had sent this? How had it arrived without going through the usual channels? And why did the sight of it fill him with such profound unease? "Just open it," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. But he couldn't. His hand trembled as he picked up the envelope for the third time, turning it over, examining the seal. It was plain wax, pressed with no identifying mark. Anonymous, intentionally mysterious. Charles set it down again and ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture he rarely allowed himself in public. He felt foolish standing here, paralyzed by a simple piece of paper. But instinct told him that once he opened this letter, something would change. Something irreversible would be set in motion. He turned away from the desk and walked to the window, trying to clear his mind. Outside, the palace grounds stretched in perfect symmetry, everything ordered and controlled. If only life could be that simple, he thought. If only decisions came with clear answers and predictable outcomes. But kingship had taught him that nothing was ever straightforward, and every choice carried consequences he couldn't always foresee. He stood there, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn, and finally made a decision. He would put the letter away, not destroy it. He couldn't bring himself to do that, but hide it somewhere safe until he found the courage to face whatever truth it held. Charles returned to his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a small compartment, hidden and built into the structure of the desk itself. He hadn't opened this secret space in years, perhaps a decade or more. The tiny key turned stiffly in the lock, and the compartment slid open with a soft click. Inside were objects from another lifetime. A photograph of his mother as a young woman, smiling in a way the public never saw. A letter written in his father's handwriting, words of advice given long ago. A pressed flower from a garden he had once walked through with someone he had loved. These were the memories he kept locked away, the pieces of himself that didn't belong to the nation but to him alone. His hands shook slightly as he placed the sealed envelope inside the compartment, nestling it among these precious fragments of his past. He told himself he would come back to it later, when his mind was clearer, when he felt stronger. But even as he thought this, Charles knew he was lying to himself. He was afraid, plain and simple. Afraid of what that letter might reveal, afraid of how it might shatter the carefully constructed stability he had worked so hard to maintain. Just as he was about to close the compartment and lock it away, he heard it. A footstep in the hallway outside. The sound was distinct, deliberate, close. Charles froze completely, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. Someone was there. Someone was standing just beyond his door, and he had no idea who it might be or how long they had been listening. The palace was full of people, of course, staff members, security, advisors. But something about this particular footstep felt wrong. It felt intentional, as though someone had been waiting for exactly this moment. Charles straightened up quickly, his instinct to appear composed overriding everything else. He stepped away from the desk, leaving the hidden compartment open, the envelope visible inside. He told himself he would return in just a moment to secure everything properly. But the footstep came again, and then another, moving away now, receding down the hallway. Whoever had been there was leaving. Charles moved toward the door, his mind racing. Should he call out? Should he investigate? Or was he simply being paranoid, reading danger into an innocent moment? He opened the door and looked out into the corridor, but there was no one there. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, silent and still. Charles felt a chill run down his spine. Had he imagined it? No, he was certain he had heard someone. But who? And why did it feel so unsettling? He stood there in the doorway, caught between returning to his desk and pursuing the phantom presence that had vanished into the palace shadows. His mind was no longer in that study. It was racing ahead, wondering who might have been listening, whether his private moment had been observed, whether someone now knew about the envelope he was so desperate to hide. In his distraction and growing anxiety, Charles made a decision that would prove fateful. He walked away from his study without returning to his desk, without closing the hidden compartment, without locking the drawer, and without securing the door properly. He left everything exposed, vulnerable, waiting to be discovered. What secret was hidden in that letter? And who had been standing outside his door, listening in the shadows? The queen who feared the truth. Queen Camilla has always been known as the villain in the story. Newspapers called her calculating, cruel, the woman who destroyed a fairy tale. Camilla had learned to carry the weight of public hatred with quiet dignity, never defending herself. That evening, Camilla found herself walking through the private wing with a purpose that felt almost dangerous. She was heading toward Charles's study, and every instinct told her to turn back, to leave well enough alone, to trust rather than investigate. But she couldn't, not after what she had found earlier that day. It had happened so innocently. Camilla had been tidying their sitting room, something she often did herself because it felt normal, human, like the life she had lived before crowns and protocol consumed everything. She was looking for a book Charles had mentioned, a collection of essays he wanted to share with her. When she pulled the volume from the shelf, a folded paper slipped out and landed at her feet. Her first instinct was to simply put it back without looking. Charles deserved privacy, everyone did. But something about the way it had been hidden, tucked carefully between pages, made her pause. She picked up the paper and recognized his handwriting immediately. The words were messy, written quickly, crossed out and rewritten multiple times. It was clearly a draft of something he had struggled to compose. Most of it was illegible, angry scribbles covering half-formed thoughts. But near the bottom, one sentence remained clear and untouched. "There are things I should have told you long ago, but I was afraid of losing you." Camilla had stood there frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. Those words pierced through her like ice. What things, what secrets had Charles been carrying? And why would he fear losing her after everything they had survived together? They had weathered storms that would have destroyed most couples. They had faced public hatred, family disapproval, and endless scrutiny. And through it all, Camilla had believed their love was honest, built on truth and trust. But now this note suggested otherwise. All afternoon the words haunted her. She tried to focus on her duties, tried to smile through a meeting with charity organizers, and tried to appear normal during dinner. But her mind kept circling back to that terrible sentence. What was Charles hiding? And more importantly, why hadn't he trusted her enough to share it? The fear grew inside her like a living thing, feeding on every doubt she had ever pushed away, every insecurity she had buried beneath her strong exterior. By evening, Camilla could bear it no longer. She wanted answers. She wanted to know what Charles was protecting, what truth he found too dangerous to share. She knew he kept his most private documents in his study, locked away in a drawer he thought no one else knew about. But Camilla knew. She had always known. She had simply respected his need for that small corner of privacy. Tonight, however, respect felt less important than truth. As she approached the study, her heart pounded so loudly she thought someone might hear it. The hallway was dim, lit only by small lamps along the walls. She noticed immediately that the door was open just slightly enough to see a sliver of light escaping from inside. That was unusual. Charles always closed his door, always locked it. Camilla's throat tightened. Was he inside? Had he discovered she knew something? Was this some kind of test? She moved closer, her hand reaching toward the door handle. All she had to do was push it open, walk inside, find whatever he had hidden in that locked drawer. The answers were right there, waiting. But as her fingers touched the polished wood, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy, steady, unmistakable. Someone was approaching. Panic surged through Camilla's chest. She couldn't be found here, not like this, not standing outside Charles's study looking guilty and desperate. What would people think? What rumors would start? The footsteps grew louder and she recognized the cadence immediately. Thomas Hale, the senior guard. A good man, loyal and observant. Too observant. Without thinking, Camilla stepped away from the door and began walking in the opposite direction, forcing her legs to move naturally even though everything inside her screamed to run. She focused on her breathing, on appearing casual, on being the queen everyone expected rather than the terrified wife she was. "Your Majesty," Thomas's voice came from behind her, respectful and warm. Camilla turned, summoning every ounce of composure she possessed. "Good evening, Thomas," she said, managing a smile that she hoped looked genuine. "Keeping watch?" "Always, ma'am," he replied, though his eyes held curiosity. He had noticed the open study door. He had noticed her presence nearby, but he was too professional to ask questions. Camilla nodded gracefully and continued down the hallway, each step taking her further from the truth she had come seeking. She could feel Thomas watching her, could sense his confusion about the open door, could imagine the thoughts forming in his mind. But she kept walking, maintaining the dignified pace expected of a queen, even as everything inside her crumbled. When she finally reached her private chambers and closed the door, the mask fell away. Camilla leaned against the wall, her hands shaking, tears threatening to spill over. She had been so close to understanding what Charles was hiding, so close to knowing whether her worst fears were justified or simply paranoia born from years of being unloved by the world. But she had walked away. Fear had stopped her. Not fear of what she might find exactly, but fear of what it would mean. If Charles was hiding something significant, something he couldn't bring himself to share even after all these years together, then what did that say about their marriage, about the foundation she thought they had built? Camilla had fought so hard for this love, had sacrificed so much, and had endured endless hatred just to stand beside him. What if it had all been built on incomplete truth? She sank into a chair, exhausted and terrified. What was in that envelope? What secret had Charles locked away? And why was she so afraid that discovering it would cost her the only thing she had ever truly wanted? To be loved completely, honestly, without reservation? What Thomas finds beneath the desk lamp. Thomas Hale saw the royal family as human beings carrying impossible burdens, and he felt honored to help shoulder even a tiny piece of that weight. His wife often teased him for caring too much, for bringing home worries about whether the king seemed tired or whether the staff were overworked. Thomas couldn't help it. Protecting people wasn't just his job, it was who he was. Standing alone in the king's study that night, Thomas felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. His eyes traveled slowly across the room, taking in every detail, the books on their shelves, the papers on the desk, the way the lamplight cast shadows across the Persian rug. And then he saw it, something so small that most people would have missed it entirely. One of the desk drawers wasn't fully closed. It stuck out perhaps half an inch, barely noticeable, but wrong nonetheless. King Charles was meticulous about his private space. Nothing was ever left out of place, especially not in this room where he kept his most personal belongings. Thomas approached the desk carefully, his training telling him to observe before touching anything. The drawer appeared to have been opened recently and closed in haste. There were no scratches, no signs of forced entry. Whoever had accessed it had done so with a key. His mind raced through possibilities. Had the king opened it himself and forgotten to close it properly? That seemed unlikely. Had someone else been here? But who would have access to the king's private study and the keys to his locked desk? He reached down and pulled the drawer open slowly, the wood sliding smoothly on its tracks. Inside was a hidden compartment, and Thomas's breath caught when he realized it was unlocked and exposed. This was no ordinary drawer. This was a secret space, and it had been left vulnerable. Lying inside was a sealed envelope, thick and substantial, marked with the royal crest pressed into deep red wax. Thomas lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside was significant. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the envelope over. Should he open it? Should he leave it alone and report what he had found? But report what, exactly? That a drawer was slightly open? That didn't explain the missing attendants, the open study door, or the strange feeling that something was deeply wrong tonight. Thomas made a decision. He wanted to understand what he was protecting. Beneath the sealed envelope, something else caught his eye. A photograph, old and faded, the edges worn soft with age. Thomas picked it up gently, holding it under the lamplight. The image showed a much younger King Charles, perhaps in his early 20s, standing in what looked like a garden. Beside him stood another person, someone Thomas didn't recognize. The photograph had been taken decades ago, judging by the clothing and the quality of the print. But what struck Thomas most was the expression on young Charles's face. He looked genuinely happy, relaxed in a way the public rarely saw, and his hand rested on the shoulder of the person beside him with unmistakable affection. Thomas studied the photograph more closely, trying to place the other person's face. Was this someone from Charles's past? A friend? Something more? And why was this picture hidden away in a secret compartment, tucked beneath a sealed envelope like it was too precious or too dangerous to display openly? He set the photograph down carefully and noticed another piece of paper beneath it. This one was folded, and when Thomas opened it, he immediately recognized the king's handwriting. But this wasn't a formal document or an official letter. This was something personal, something unfinished. The writing was shaky, as though Charles had struggled to form the words. Sentences started and stopped abruptly. Phrases were crossed out. The whole page felt like a man wrestling with something he couldn't quite express. Thomas's eyes scanned the visible words, trying to make sense of the fragmentary thoughts. One line near the top read, "I should have been honest from the beginning." Further down, partially obscribed by crossouts, he could make out, "The choices I made were meant to protect." The rest was illegible. Near the bottom, in slightly steadier handwriting, appeared the words, "You deserve to know the truth, but I was afraid." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. What truth was the king referring to? What had he been afraid to reveal? And to whom was this letter intended? Thomas looked again at the photograph, at the sealed envelope, at the unfinished words scattered across the page. These weren't random items carelessly stored away. These were pieces of a story, fragments of something the king had kept hidden for years, perhaps decades. His mind spun with questions. Who was the person in the photograph? What was inside the sealed envelope? Why had King Charles written and abandoned this letter? And most urgently, why had all of this been left exposed tonight, vulnerable to discovery? Thomas's instinct screamed that this wasn't accidental. Someone had been here. Someone had opened this compartment and either been interrupted or deliberately left it for someone else to find. Just as Thomas was trying to process everything before him, a sudden sharp noise erupted from the hallway outside. It sounded like something heavy falling, followed by rapid footsteps. Thomas's head snapped toward the door, his body instantly alert. Someone was out there. Someone was moving quickly through the private wing where no one should be at this hour. He carefully placed the photograph and letter back into the compartment, his mind racing. Should he pursue whoever was in the hallway? Should he secure these items first? Every second mattered now. If someone else knew about this hidden drawer, if someone else was searching for these secrets, then the king's privacy, and possibly his safety, was at risk. Thomas moved swiftly toward the door, his training overriding his confusion. But even as he stepped into the hallway, looking for the cause of the noise, one question burned in his mind louder than all the others. Who else knew what the king had been hiding, and what were they willing to do to expose it? Charles and Camilla faced the truth. King Charles III was also someone who kept secrets, not out of cruelty but out of fear, fear of judgment, fear of disappointment, fear of losing the people who meant everything to him. Queen Camilla was his opposite in many ways, yet perfectly matched. Where Charles retreated into careful silence, Camilla pushed forward with honest directness. She was warm and genuine, someone who could make a stranger feel like an old friend within minutes. Camilla had survived decades of public hatred by developing an almost unshakable inner strength, yet she remained surprisingly vulnerable when it came to Charles. She loved him with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her, and she protected their relationship like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because to her, it was. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, and endured too many painful years to lose him now. Camilla was loyal, practical, and deeply kind, but tonight kindness was giving way to desperation. Charles rushed through the palace corridors with unusual urgency, his heart pounding against his ribs. A staff member had discreetly informed him that someone had been seen near his private study, that the door had been found open, that things might have been disturbed. Panic seized him immediately. The compartment, the envelope, the photograph. Everything he had tried so desperately to keep hidden might now be exposed. His legs moved faster, his breathing coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with pure terror. He rounded the corner into the private wing and nearly collided with Camilla, who appeared from the opposite direction, looking equally frantic. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Charles knew. She had been there. She had seen something. Or perhaps she was coming to confront him about what she had discovered earlier. Either way, the moment he had dreaded for years was finally here. "Charles," Camilla said, his name barely a whisper. Her face was pale and her hands were trembling visibly. She looked frightened in a way he had rarely seen, and it broke something inside him. "Camilla, I can explain," he started, but the words died in his throat. How could he explain decades of silence? How could he make her understand choices he had made long before they had built this life together? They stood there in the hallway for a suspended moment, neither quite knowing how to begin. Then, wordlessly, they walked together into the study. The hidden compartment remained open, just as Thomas had left it after being called away by the noise in the corridor. The photograph lay on the desk, face up under the lamplight. The unfinished letter rested beside it. The sealed envelope waited like a judgment. Charles moved toward the desk slowly, as though approaching something dangerous. He picked up the photograph with careful fingers, and the moment he did, Camilla's sharp intake of breath told him everything. She recognized the face, the person standing beside his younger self in that garden all those years ago. "That's," Camilla began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Her voice caught and tears filled her eyes. Charles nodded slowly, unable to look at her. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." "How long have you kept this hidden?" Camilla asked, and her voice trembled with something between hurt and anger. "How long have you been carrying this secret?" "Decades," Charles admitted, his voice barely audible. He set the photograph down and finally forced himself to meet her gaze. "Since before we were together. Since before everything." Camilla's hand moved to the unfinished letter, her fingers hovering over the shaky handwriting. "What were you trying to write?" she demanded, her composure cracking completely. "What were you planning to tell me that you couldn't say out loud?" Charles felt tears burning behind his eyes. He had imagined this conversation countless times, rehearsed explanations that never felt adequate, prepared defenses that always seemed hollow. But now, standing before the woman he loved more than anything, watching her pain and confusion, all his carefully constructed barriers crumbled. "I was trying to explain a choice I made long ago," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "A choice that shaped everything that came after. A choice I've regretted every single day since." "What choice?" Camilla pressed, and now tears were streaming down her face. "What did you do, Charles?" He took a shaky breath, and the truth he had carried alone for so many years finally began to surface. "The person in that photograph, they were important to me. More important than I was allowed to admit. More important than duty permitted. And I made a decision back then to protect the monarchy, to protect my future, to do what was expected of me." His voice broke. "I walked away from something real because I was afraid. And that person, they never recovered from what I did." Camilla stared at him, processing his words. "You loved them," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Charles whispered, "in a way I couldn't acknowledge, in a way that would have destroyed everything. So I buried it. I pretended it didn't matter. and they paid the price for my cowardice. "Why are you telling me this now?" Camilla asked, her voice raw. "Why hide it for all these years and suddenly decide I need to know?" Charles reached for her hand, desperate for connection, even as he confessed his deepest shame. "Because I'm tired of secrets. Because you deserve to know who I am, not just the version I've presented. Because I love you, Camilla, and I can't keep hiding pieces of myself and expect our marriage to survive." Camilla pulled her hand away, and Charles felt his world tilting. "What else is in that envelope?" she asked, pointing to the sealed document that still waited, unopened. Charles looked at it, his face crumbling with grief. "The truth about what happened to them, about where they are now, about the consequences of my choices." He paused, struggling to continue. "I received it recently, and I couldn't bring myself to open it because I knew it would force me to face everything I've spent decades running from." The silence that followed was suffocating. Camilla stood there, torn between compassion and betrayal, love and anger, understanding and hurt. Charles waited, barely breathing, knowing that whatever happened next would determine everything. What secret had King Charles protected for so long? And could their love survive the truth he had finally spoken? What becomes of the envelope? King Charles noticed when staff members looked tired and quietly arranged for them to have breaks. He remembered birthdays, asked about sick relatives, and treated everyone from ambassadors to gardeners with equal respect. There was a poet's soul trapped inside a king's body, and the tension between who he was and who he had to be had defined his entire existence. Charles carried grief like a constant companion, grief for lost time, lost chances, lost love. He was a man who had learned to live with regret, to smile through sadness, to carry on when everything inside him wanted to stop. But he was also brave in quiet ways, willing to face uncomfortable truths when the moment demanded it, willing to sacrifice his own comfort for what he believed was right. The study felt different now, charged with a tension that made the air itself seem heavy. Charles stood at his desk holding the sealed envelope, turning it over and over in his hands as though the physical motion might somehow prepare him for what lay inside. The royal crest pressed into the red wax seemed to mock him, a reminder that even his most private pain was bound by duty and tradition. His fingers traced the edges of the thick paper, feeling its weight, understanding with complete clarity that once he broke that seal, there would be no going back. Some truths once spoken could never be unspoken. Some doors once opened could never be closed again. Behind him, Camilla stood in absolute silence. She had said nothing for several minutes now, simply watching him with an expression that held equal parts love and fear. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white from the pressure. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell him it would be all right, wanted to demand he explain everything before opening that envelope. But she couldn't. This was Charles's choice to make, his truth to face, his past to confront. All she could do was stand there and wait, supporting him through her presence, even as her heart broke with uncertainty. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking another quarter hour slipping into history. Charles glanced at it and realized it was nearly midnight. This entire impossible evening had unfolded in just a few hours, yet it felt like a lifetime. Everything had changed so quickly, the discovery, the confrontation, the confession, and now this final moment, holding the last piece of a puzzle he had spent decades trying to keep scattered. A soft knock at the door interrupted the heavy silence. Both Charles and Camilla turned as Thomas Hale stepped into the room, his expression respectful but serious. The guard had been waiting outside, giving them privacy, but duty mandated him to make his report. Thomas stood at attention, but there was kindness in his eyes, an understanding that this was more than just a security matter. "Your Majesty," Thomas began quietly, his voice steady and professional. "I need to explain what I found and why I entered your study without explicit permission." Charles nodded slowly, setting the envelope down on the desk. "Please, Thomas, tell me everything." Thomas took a careful breath and began recounting the evening's events with precise detail. He described arriving for his shift, noticing the unusual absence of attendants, finding the study door open, hearing the mysterious sounds from inside. He explained how he had discovered the drawer slightly open, the hidden compartment exposed, the items within seemingly left for discovery. His voice remained calm and measured, but Charles could hear the underlying concern. "I made a judgment call, sir," Thomas continued. "The security of this room had been compromised. I wanted to understand what might be at risk. I saw the photograph, the unfinished letter. I did not read deeply into your private correspondence, but I saw enough to know that something significant was happening. I heard a noise in the corridor and went to investigate. When I returned, I secured the items and waited for guidance." Charles listened to every word, and when Thomas finished, he felt an unexpected wave of gratitude. This man had stumbled onto his deepest secrets and had handled them with dignity and discretion. "Thank you, Thomas," Charles said sincerely. "You did exactly right. Your judgment and your discretion mean more to me than you can know." Thomas bowed his head slightly. "I serve at your Majesty's pleasure. Whatever you need from me, including my complete silence, you have it." "I know," Charles replied, and the weight of that trust settled over him. He looked at Camilla, then at the envelope, then back at Thomas. "Would you stay, please? I think I need witnesses for what comes next. People I trust." Thomas looked surprised but nodded and took a position near the door, standing at ease but attentive. Camilla moved closer to Charles, finally breaking her silence. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. "Once you open it, we can't know what's inside." "I'm certain," Charles said, though his voice trembled slightly. "I've run from this long enough. Whatever truth is in here, I need to face it. We need to face it." He picked up the envelope one final time, feeling its weight in his hands. The room was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. With deliberate slowness, Charles slid his finger under the wax seal and broke it. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. He opened the envelope carefully and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in unfamiliar handwriting. There was also a smaller envelope inside, sealed separately, with his name written across it in letters he recognized immediately. Handwriting from his past, from someone he had thought lost forever. Charles began to read, and with each line his expression shifted through surprise, grief, understanding, and finally something that looked almost like relief. Camilla watched him closely, desperate to know what he was learning, but respecting his need to process it first. Minutes passed in tense silence. Thomas remained motionless by the door, a silent guardian of this intensely private moment. Finally, Charles finished reading. He set the papers down gently and looked up at Camilla with tears streaming down his face. "They're alive," he whispered, his voice breaking. "After all these years, after everything I thought I knew, they're alive." Camilla's hand flew to her mouth. "Where?" she managed to ask. "Living quietly, far from here, under a different name," Charles said, his words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. "They never blamed me. They understood why I made the choices I did. But they want me to know the truth about what happened after I left, about the child." His voice caught completely. "Child?" Camilla breathed, and the single word held a universe of implications. Charles nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally continued, his voice was barely audible. "A child I never knew existed. A life I never knew I helped create. They've grown up not knowing who I am, protected from this world, given a chance at normalcy that I could never have provided." The revelation hung in the air like something tangible. Thomas shifted slightly but remained professional, his face carefully neutral despite the monumental secret he was now part of. Camilla sank into a chair, processing the magnitude of what Charles had just shared. This wasn't just about past love or hidden relationships. This was about family, about blood, about a person walking through the world carrying Charles's legacy without even knowing it. "What are you going to do?" Camilla finally asked, and her voice held no judgment, only genuine question. Charles walked to the window and looked out at the palace grounds. Dawn was beginning to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was coming, bringing with it impossible choices. He could keep this secret, bury it again, pretend he never opened the envelope. Or he could acknowledge this truth, reach out to the person he had loved and lost. Try to build some kind of relationship with a child who didn't know they were connected to a king. I don't know yet, Charles admitted, his reflection visible in the glass. But I know I can't keep hiding. I can't keep living half a life, protecting an image while denying reality. Whatever I decide, it has to be honest. It has to be real. Camilla stood and walked to him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. Despite everything, the shock, the hurt, the complexity of what this meant for their marriage, she was still there, still standing beside him. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said quietly. "Whatever comes next, you don't have to face it alone." Charles turned to her, gratitude and love overwhelming him. He had spent so many years afraid that truth would destroy everything he valued. But standing here with Camilla's hand on his shoulder and Thomas's steady presence bearing witness, he realized that maybe honesty was the only thing that could save them all. As the sun rose fully over Buckingham Palace, King Charles III made a decision that would change everything. He would reach out. He would seek connection. He would try to build something real from the wreckage of decades of silence.